Hey everybody. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about the nature versus nurture debate, which I've asked you to address in the online discussion. In that discussion, as I've read through your responses, I noticed that most of you seem to come down most heavily in favor of nurture. Even those of you who start off your response by saying it's both really seem to embrace the nurture part of the debate. And that makes a lot of sense. If for no other reason, because for those of us in the class who are culturally born and raised in the United States, we've been indoctrinated or we've been enculturated in this idea of the individual, of self, uh, of individual freedom, of individual choices. So the nurture part of the debate is really appealing because that very nicely meshes with the cultural views and values that we share in the United States. And having said that, we really need to look at this argument and understand the consequences and the implications of both nature and nurture. So let's take a minute and look at the two sides of the debate. We'll start with nurture. Nurture is from the ideas proposed in the 17th century by a philosopher known as John Locke. And what Locke had to say was that when we're born, we're a blank slate, tabula rasa, as he called it. And what that means is think of a chalkboard or a whiteboard in a classroom with absolutely nothing on it. And that's how we're born. And then as we experience the world from the day that we're born, our experiences start to write on that slate. They start to leave an imprint on that chalkboard or whiteboard. And over time, that imprint that is left develops into our personality. Seems to make a lot of sense. Obviously, the environment that we're raised in seems to influence the person that we become. We'd like to think it does in some way, shape, or form. On the flip side, we have the nature part of the argument, the opposing view. The nature part of the debate really came into focus in the 1970s, about 20 years after the structure of the DNA molecule had been figured out, and genetics was really kind of taking off as a science. And in a book called Sociobiology, the nature side of the debate was pretty clearly spelled out. And what it said was that our personality is simply a consequence of our genes. That what we are, who we are, how we think, the things that we like, the things that we don't like, how we be, all of that stuff is controlled by our genes and the chemical interactions that they cause to go on in our cells, and the way they encourage our cells to behave, and the way they encourage our body to behave. That's where our personality comes from. There are clear consequences and implications to both nature and nurture. So if we take a minute to think about those consequences, it becomes pretty clear that neither one of these explanations is really suitable to completely explain our personality. Let's start with nurture. If nurture is right, your genes don't matter. Doesn't matter if you're a boy or a girl when you're born, your biological sex doesn't matter, your ancestry doesn't matter. Nothing that you genetically bring into this world with you matters. You are a blank slate, and for that reason, you can become anything you want. Or perhaps more importantly, you can become whatever the person or people who most control your environment want you to become. What nurture really means is that I can make you into whatever I want if I control your environment in just the right way. If I want you to become a Nobel Peace Prize winner, I control your environment so that you become a Nobel Peace Prize winner. There's no genetic impact on your intelligence or your intellectual abilities. If I want you to become an NFL lineman, I control your environment and you become an NFL lineman. There's no genetic contribution to your athletic abilities. If I want you to be a homosexual or a heterosexual, I can make you into a homosexual or a heterosexual. If I want you to become Adolf Hitler or Jeffrey Dahmer, I can make you into one of history's most genocidal maniacs or one of the United States' most infamous serial killers, and it's all based on your environment. And some people would say, there's evidence to support that. I mean, we look at serial killers. Just think about serial killers, and if you look at them, you will note that most serial killers share a number of environmental and social characteristics in common. They tend to come from broken homes where there's a lot of abuse, a lot of alcohol and drugs, might be some sexual abuse. They tend to be loners and outcasts, social outcasts. So, there are several of these social characteristics that they share in common. But there's a problem, because if you make a list of, say, 10 or 15 traits that all or most serial killers share in common, what you'll also notice is there are tens of thousands, if not millions of people who also share those traits in common, but they don't become serial killers. So how do we explain that if we have two people that are nurtured in the same way, two brothers raised in the same home, being nurtured in virtually the same way, one of them becomes a serial killer and the other one doesn't? Or two people that aren't even related but are raised in a similar environment, and one of them becomes a successful business leader and another one winds up in prison because of drug crimes or a homicide or some other violent crime. So this idea of nurture, the most troubling implication of nurture is this idea that our personalities are malleable and that we can be made into anything. As a bit of an aside, there is legitimate, notice the quotation figures, legitimate historical research into the question of whether or not Adolf Hitler had a single testicle. Why? Why do we care if Adolf Hitler had a single testicle? And what does that have to do with personality and gender or nature versus nurture? Well, it's important because if Hitler had a single testicle, or if Hitler had 3 testicles, as some other people argue, then we can point to that and we can say, aha, that's what made him angry. That's what made him different. That's why he did what he did, because he's different from the rest of us. If we can't find something that makes Hitler different from the rest of us, then the scary implication, particularly with using nurture as our framework, is that every one of us has the potential to do what Adolf Hitler did. And most of us would not like to think that we could do what Adolf Hitler did. But if nurture is right, put in that proper environment, you could do the very same thing. Now let's look at the nature side. There are implications of nature. First of all, I should say that there are all sorts of studies that show the validity, to a certain extent, of the nature argument. There are numerous twin studies of twins that are separated at birth. There was two twins. One was named Gerald Levy, and the other was named Martin Newman. They were identical twin brothers, separated at birth, adopted out, raised in very different environments, didn't have any contact until their late 20s or early 30s. But when they came together, they both had the same job. They're both firefighters. They had the same hobbies. They liked the same foods. Some very strong similarities between these two men who were raised in vastly different environments, were nurtured quite differently, but share 100% of their genetics. So that would strongly indicate some sort of genetic input on our personality. Another twin study that some of you may be familiar with is the case of David Reimer. He wrote a book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Girl. I'd really encourage you to look at the story of David Reimer just real quickly. I don't want this to be too long, but as a 6-month-old or 3-month-old infant, during what should have been a routine circumcision, the doctors made a mistake and basically excised his penis. So rather than try to reconstruct it, a psychologist encouraged his parents, who were very young kids, this was in Calgary, Canada, I believe. They were overwhelmed by the situation. He encouraged David's parents to have him undergo a surgical sex change, and they could raise him as a girl. Later, once she got a little bit older, she'd have hormone therapy to develop breasts and things like that. And the beautiful, is that David had a twin brother named Brian. Again, an identical twin. And the idea was that this would prove nurture, that if David could be raised as a girl, it would show that the genetics is just window dressing, and that our environment is what matters. To put matters simply, the experiment failed horribly. By the time she was 7 or 8 years old, Brenda was her name. She was miserable. She hated wearing dresses and having long hair. People teased her because of the way she walked. She wanted to play with guns and trucks and stuff. And finally, her parents told her, about the time she was 14 years old, her parents told her what had happened on the advice of another psychologist. And she made the decision to undergo a second surgical sex change to convert back to her biological sense, because as he writes in his book, finally everything kind of made sense. He understood why he was the way he was, and he wasn't some sort of a freak. So the case of David Reimer really illustrates that there is something important in our genetics. As a bit of an aside, David Reimer did have convert back to his biological sex. That didn't stop his troubles. There was a lot of, as you might imagine, there were a lot of emotional consequences to what he'd gone through. And about 10 years ago, David Reimer ended up committing suicide as he struggled with depression and other psychological issues related to what had happened to him. But again, the Reimer example really illustrates, or twin studies really illustrate, this important genetic architecture that our personality is built on. But the consequence becomes, if nature is right, then our genes are our destiny. Doesn't matter what else you do, your genes are going to control you. So if you have a gene for Alzheimer's, or you have a gene for particular types of cancer, or you have genes for some other debilitating condition later on in life, nothing you do early on will matter. Don't bother to change your diet. Don't bother to change your environment. Don't bother to change anything, because those genes are there. You carry them, and you are going to have that condition. Fortunately, we understand that that's not exactly the case. But the challenge, one of the challenges, is that we know, it's obvious, based on the consequences of nature and nurture, that it's not either one or the other, but it is an interaction. You have your underlying genetic architecture, and then you have your, I'm waving my hands in front of the screen, I should sit back here. You have your underlying genetic architecture, and then you have your environment. And they interact in some way to produce your personality. But for each trait, how much of it is genetic and how much of it is environmental? Is it 50-50? Is it 80% genetic and 20% environmental? Is it 20% genetic and 80% environmental? And that seems to vary from trait to trait. There's a psychologist named David Hare, Dr. David Hare, who does research with sociopathy. And what he notes, he has a test that can be done in infants, I think as young as 6 months, but it might be a year, to determine if this child is a sociopath, if a child is a sociopath. And statistically, about 1 out of every 1,500 people in the world is a sociopath. And what it means to be a sociopath is that you have no empathy, that you do not understand how your actions impact other people. So you are completely oblivious to the suffering and pain that you cause other people through your actions. And in Hare's research, or his test, it's a hearing test. Put a set of headphones on a baby, and there's this repetitive set of tones that the baby listens to. And then at the end of this set of tones, there's one loud, jarring, uncomfortable tone that causes them at the very least discomfort, if not actual pain. And in normal children, in normal infants, as they hear these tones, as it gets towards the end, and they recognize that they're going to hear this painful tone, their heart rate increases, their breathing increases, their stress levels increase, they might start to cry. By comparison, in sociopaths, complete flatline, no change at all. They just ride it out. It doesn't influence them at all. And what Hare has found in his work with teenagers and young adults and adults with sociopathy is that there's no treatment to change a sociopath into a not a sociopath. There's nothing that you can do that is going to make them understand empathy. But again, so this is a trait that would seem to be at least 90% genetic. And I say 90% because even though there's no way to treat somebody for sociopathy, you can't give them particular drugs or things like that. There are differences in how sociopathy is expressed. Yes, some sociopaths do really hurtful and harmful things to other people. Other sociopaths, and we look at them as criminals, or we look at them in a very negative light, but it's also quite likely that a lot of successful business owners are sociopaths, because these are people who are able to make really cold, calculated, harsh business decisions that will ensure their business success, but oftentimes at the consequence of their employees or to other people. And face it, these are people that we tend to look up to. They're the millionaires and the billionaires and the owners of the Fortune 500 companies and the leaders of industry that kind of make the economy run. So we look at these people in a positive light. But the real scary implication of nature is this idea that what do if in fact our genes are our destiny? As we've gotten more adept at looking at our genetic makeup at individual genomes, we can do tests and we can look at the different genes that people have. And already, as people who want to have children, you can pick genes that your baby's going to have. You can pick eye color, you can pick hair color, you can pick sex if you have enough money. So what if we can begin to identify genes? Like, say, hypothetically, there's a gene for being a serial killer. What if we could identify that in some sort of a prenatal test? Yes, ma'am, congratulations, Mrs. Smith. You're going to have a boy, but unfortunately your son carries the serial killer gene. What do we do? I mean, do we tell Mrs. Smith that she has to terminate her pregnancy? Do we allow Mrs. Smith to carry that pregnancy to term, but then we put the serial killer to be in an infant prison of some sort? Do we tell her, gee, it's really unfortunate that at some point your son is going to grab a high-powered rifle and climb up on a clock tower somewhere and see how many people he can knock down? But really, that becomes one of the really scary implications of nature, if in fact E.O. Wilson in social biology is correct. And as Dr. Hare's research illustrates, there's some legitimacy to the idea that there are certain traits that if you have them, they're going to be expressed. If genetically you carry a particular trait, it will be expressed. There are plenty of other traits that you might carry it, and it doesn't get expressed just because you have the light, just because you're predisposed to a particular type of cancer, you are living in an environment in a particular way that makes you less susceptible to that type of cancer. Or alcoholism is another good example. Several of you used it in the discussion. There is a gene that predisposes people to alcoholism, but most people who are alcoholics don't carry that gene. Odds are that alcoholism is a trait that is much more environmentally or socially influenced than it is biologically. So whereas sociopathy might be 90% genetic and 10% environmental or 10% social, alcoholism might be 90% social and only 10% environmental. So figuring out where that overlap exists can be quite challenging and quite difficult, but it can also be very important because of the implications for how we react to any of those types of traits and any of those types of behaviors. So I hope this has helped you shed some light on the nature versus nurture debate. Obviously, if you have any questions or concerns or anything you'd like me to clear up, feel free to ask me in the discussion. I look forward to hearing from you.